Hey, everybody. I am Stephanie Goss, and this is another episode of the Uncharted Podcast. And this week on the podcast, I am not joined by the songmeister, Andy Rourke. I am joined by a dear friend of mine, Dr. Megan Gilhooly. Megan is the Vice President of Veterinary Affairs for Banfield Pet Hospital, and she is an amazing leader. She's one of those people that when I met her and got to know her, I was like, can I please work for this woman? Because I could learn so much as a leader. And I had a topic come through our community that we were talking about. And when I started thinking about it, I was like, I really want to do a podcast on this. And I really want to talk about it with Megan. And this is one of those episodes where I feel like I could have sat here for another hour and had an even longer conversation about it. But we're talking today about the fear of failure in veterinary medicine. And I think there are some invaluable lessons around failing as a leader. And I love Megan's approach as a leader to the idea of failure. And I had so much fun talking this through with her. Let's get into it.
And now, the Uncharted Podcast.
And we're back. It's me, Stephanie Goss, and I am here sans my partner in crime, Andy Rourke, this week. But I am very excited to introduce all of you to one of my favorite humans in veterinary medicine. I have with me today Dr. Megan Gilhooly. Megan is a vice president at Banfield. She's the vice president of Veterinary Affairs now, right? And we met through a leadership program. We've known each other for a few years now. And I was coming up with plans for the podcast. And I was thinking about, as veterinary medicine has grown and changed, we're seeing a lot more hospitals, whether they are corporate groups themselves or private practices that are getting bigger. More people in the industry are leaning into more formalized leadership structures. And that comes with amazing benefits and also comes with some challenges, right? And so our team has been talking a lot. We're getting ready to do our regional leaders summit. We've been doing our medical director summit and practice manager summits for the last couple of years. And there's more and more things that are specific to those groups. And in your career in particular with Banfield, you've had a lot of experience being the leader of leaders, the manager of managers. And when you move out of that role where you are doing the work and you're in a role like practicing medicine every day, and you step out of that into a leadership position, the way that you approach problems and what you do every day changes dramatically. And so we had some conversation around, you and I were having a completely separate conversation, and you started talking about the benefits of what happens when we let our people leaders fail a little bit. And I was like, oh my God, we have to do a podcast about this. This makes me so happy. So I've got a bunch of questions for you, but before we kind of get going, do you want to tell everybody kind of a little bit about your journey in veterinary medicine? And obviously you went to vet school, but now you're not working in a practice all the time, but you have had kind of an amazing career. And I would love for people to get to know you because you are awesome. So tell us a little bit about your journey.
Of course. So I knew from the time I was little, right? I wanted to be a veterinarian. I'm that cliche.
You were one of those.
I'm one of those. And I was a crazy horse kid. I'm still a crazy horse kid at heart.
Also one of those. Okay.
Yep. And so all I wanted to do was be an equine practitioner. And that becomes important because it's just part of my journey. So anyways, I went to undergrad thinking that I was going to be a veterinarian and did all the things. And then went to Louisiana State for veterinary school, which is very interesting because I'm from the Pacific Northwest. So I wanted to get as far away from Oregon as possible and ended up at LSU, which is good. There's some good perspective there. Anyways,
very different experience having grown up in the Pacific Northwest.
So different, but in really good ways because I think one of the things that I've always wondered about is how do I teach people perspective? And I think perspective comes through life experience, and that will become important, I think, a little bit later when we talk about failure. But, I went to vet school with a very narrow vision of I'm just going to be a horse doctor. That's all I wanted to do. I didn't want to touch a small animal. I just was like, yeah, they're cute. I like dogs and cats. I like to own dogs and cats. I like them in my house, but I'm not going to ever work on them. So there's no need for me to do the things, right? Young Megan really wishes that old Megan would have told her that perhaps you should have opened your lens a little bit more. But anyways, we'll get to that part. So
isn't it fun how hindsight works?
Hindsight, right? So anyways, went to veterinary school, did an internship after veterinary school at Texas A&M because, again, I just wanted to be an equine practitioner.
You were all in. Yeah. Okay.
More specifically, I wanted to be an internist. And all I wanted to do was go to Texas A&M and do my residency there. So internship there, only applied to residency at Texas A&M, and I didn't get it. And so that's the first failure, if you will. And pivot in my career. And so then I was like, oh, goodness gracious, I need to make money. Number one, I'm a starving
student loan bills.
Veterinary student or intern. And I had done a lot of work at a practice in Louisiana that I loved. And so I knew they were hiring. So I went back to Louisiana and practiced as a racetrack practitioner for like 9 years-ish. And, did like all the things that
the horsey thing,
the horse world does, right? I was super into neonates, did foals. That was my thing. Loved it so much. And ended up being a partner in that practice, which is where I kind of like dipped my toe into more of the leadership side of things. I love the autonomy. I love the business acumen, all of the things. But then I had children in 2012, and I didn't just have children, I had twins. So needed to make some different life choices because I was very far away from my family. So ended up moving back home and worked as an ambulatory equine practitioner for a year. Really didn't enjoy my job or my life. And it was mainly because I didn't feel very empowered by my leader, by my boss. I had come from this space of autonomy and, practice ownership. And here I am stepping back into more of that, individual contributor space. And I didn't feel like my opinions were heard and all those kinds of things. And so burnt out really hard to the point where I was really ready to walk away from veterinary medicine. And I didn't, obviously, or else I wouldn't be here today. My dad, who gives fantastic advice, was like, maybe you should, before you walk away, look at other aspects, right, of veterinary medicine. So I did. So I applied to some small animal practices, and Banfield was one of them. Very transparent about, I have not spayed a dog since 2005, and this is 2014.
I
can castrate anything. I can sew up anything. Give me all the abscesses. I'll do all those things. However, I'm a little nervous about entering the abdomen of a small animal. And so anyways, Banfield was who I chose, and I chose them primarily because of onboarding and all of the things, but also just, perspective again, right? I'm coming from equine medicine, where I'm working 6.5 days a week. I'm on call 50% of the time. And I hear, we need you to work 4 days a week. And if we ask you to work more, you can say no, but we'll pay you for it. And you get to leave at, 6 o'clock in the evening and your work doesn't come home with you. And so that was very different than what I had experienced. So that sounded really magic. Plus my last practice before Banfield, I had some just interesting interactions, I would say, with my employer, where I felt like, and this happens sometimes in small business, right? Like we weren't necessarily following the letter of the law when it comes to employment law. And so there's something about employee protections and associate concept when you work for a large organization. And that was really interesting to me because I'd gotten burned pretty hard. So anywho, started with Banfield in the hospitals as a doctor, grew myself into like a lead vet, then became a chief of staff, which is just a medical leader at the hospital level. And then there was a role that opened up centrally at our corporate office that was about acquisitions and designing medical quality assessments for acquisition hospitals, because back in the day we would acquire some hospitals. So I threw my hat in the ring for that role, and I ended up getting that role. And then, the rest is really history from a career perspective, because then it was, growing into more of a field-facing role where I built a team and we were accountable to tools, resources, training, equipment deployments, trials for our hospitals. And then a couple years ago, I elected to go back out into the field as the Vice President of Veterinary Quality, which is just like a regional medical leader for Banfield. And then I came back in August of 2022. We'll say August of 2022, I think. Gosh, time is hard. And in my current role. And so in my current role, I lead our quality programs, our patient safety programs, our analytics team, and then all of the doctor programs that are in the field. And it has been a wild ride, but a really cool, fun ride.
With all of the different experience, like you have really kind of had the exposure gamut. I love that you were one of those kids that's like, I'm going to be a vet. And I love it because I love to see people like yourself who have a passion for the patients and the medicine, and also realize that who you are as a person is really important. And it is okay to make pivots and choices that support who you are as a person, that there is so much opportunity out there in our field and in our industry to do things that directly benefit patient care, directly benefit clients and hospitals, but are not necessarily doing that work every day. And for some people, that is the right fit, just the way that being in the practice and holding a patient every day is the right fit for others. So like, I love that so much. Tell me a little bit about kind of where our conversation started. Was really about how important as leaders, because you and I have both had the experience of being leaders of people, being practice owners, being in charge, like feeling like the successes and also the failures and the growth of the people that are on your team are on your shoulders, really. Why do you think that failure is such a key piece of that? Because we see a lot of leaders, especially in veterinary medicine, focus so hard on the getting to success. And when failure happens, and this was the cornerstone of our conversation, when failure happens, the approach for a lot of leaders is the lens is very narrow, and it is focused solely on, and I think one of the things that we talk about a lot in Uncharted is the idea that accountability sometimes means that there is responsibility that can look like punishment, for lack of a better word, or, breaking the rules, and you're held accountable to that. Sometimes that's what it can look like. And as leaders, really our job for the most part should be that the majority of accountability looks very positive and is developmental and learning about how we grow in a different way or better, versus, hey, you screwed this up and now I'm going to make your life miserable as a result. So why do you think that failure as a leader, someone who has, now you're leading teams that are responsible for like decisions that trickle down to the practices every day, but also on a really large scale, right? Why do you think that failure is such an important part of that leadership development for your people?
Yeah, I think nobody's perfect, number one, right? And so, we're always going to have little missteps. And, I used to talk a lot to my team about failure is inevitable, right? We're not going to be perfect. We're not going to hit every single thing, but it's what we learn from it that is so important. And it's also about recognizing when things are going off the rails and having, either the courage to raise your hand and say, I don't know what to do, or having a plan to be like, okay, like this is going off the rails. I'm going to have to do A, B, C, and D about it. Right. And so I think it's growth at the end of the day. It really helps with that personal growth. And you said something important about accountability, that it shouldn't be punitive, right? To me, accountability is about ownership. It says that you own the thing. And so I think failure is also a piece of that to a certain extent, because it's like you're owning of like, I tried this, it didn't work. Here's why it didn't work. Here's what I learned from it. And here's what I'm going to do differently in the future. And I think the other piece too is really being clear and defining the boundaries of that failure, right? Because like, you don't want to fail and have, catastrophic, consequences from it.
Right.
But it's okay to have little tiny things happen along the way, as long as we learn from them and as long as we own it, And so I'm a big Peloton fan. Oh, I know. So cliche, but I don't care.
Andy's our CrossFitter. You can be a Pelotoner.
I know. I saw that. I was like, go, Andy. But they have this thing about progress over perfection, right? Yeah. And I think that's so important, because we are human beings and human beings make mistakes, and we can never be perfect. That's unattainable at the end of the day. So, how do we make failure safer? how do we make sure that we've defined what those boundaries are? And then how do we have plans and like almost like a contract between leader and direct report around what are those boundaries of failure, right? And when should you raise your hand? And what does success look like,
Well, and I think that is the hard part it was the hard part for me. And I think it's the hard part for a lot of people when it comes to being the team member, when accountability feels punitive and when that's the way that you are asked to learn is by whether it's just dealing on your own with all of the consequences or feeling like you got thrown under the bus or being punished in some way for it, whether it's a performance improvement plan or, getting written up or losing your job. All of those kind of things make you as a human get the message in your lizard brain that failure and making mistakes is bad. And so then as we go forward in our journey as humans and as employees and as people, professionals, we are afraid to make mistakes.
Yeah.
And so, because it takes being taught that it's okay to make mistakes and creating that safety, to your point, let's make the small mistakes so that we don't make the catastrophic mistakes. And I feel like I've been in clinics where the catastrophic mistakes happen a lot. And it's generally because those are environments where it doesn't feel safe to fail, where people are afraid to put their hand up and say, oh, like I need help, or, oh, I realize that I made a mistake and now I need to fix it. And here's, to your point, I would have been afraid, I'm thinking in particular of one practice that I worked in, to put my hand up and say that I made the mistake because I would have felt like it was not only going to be a big problem, but also that I would be kind of left on my own to sort it out. And that's not, to me, that is not the kind of leadership that gets results. And like, you can smack people with a stick and you can drive results in that way. And the results are going to come to a stop significantly quicker than if you teach people how to raise their hands when they need to and get some carrots along the way, right? Like when we reward them with that behavior.
Yeah. I mean, my thing is like, I want to build teams that the magic happens when I'm not there, Yes. And if you create those environments where you're just driving and beating and whipping and spurring, right? What happens when you take away that pressure? Probably the forward momentum is going to stop. To your point, there's ways to get results that don't feel great. And there's ways to get results that are mutual, that, bring the associate along, that motivate, that inspire. And there's room to have little moments where you step in it, because you will step in it. And I have definitely been in spaces where, I have failed. I've been in spaces where I don't feel safe to ask questions. That's why I left my last job before coming to Banfield. And I was surprised with accountability and performance conversations. And you should never be surprised.
Yes.
You should never be surprised. And so, at the end of the day, like it comes down to feedback and communication and doing it in a way that is clear, kind, empathetic, and actionable.
Yeah. I love that. What do you think? This is important because I see, having worked on both sides of the coin, right? Having worked in the practice and then also having worked in a like field leader level where you are now the manager of managers and you are responsible for the performance of the hospital in a very different way because you're not hands-on affecting the change, but what is happening in the hospital sits on your shoulders. And I think we see a lot of this. I have seen a lot of this behavior at that more multi-site or regional level leader, right? Where you are managing the people. And there seems to be this fear at that level more than anything of letting go of the reins and letting the failure happen. What is actually the fear? What are people that are in that role afraid of when it comes to letting their people fail? Because I've been told by leaders like this is the goal. You have to hit it. No ifs, ands, or buts. But I never had an understanding or a feeling of like, but why? Like, what are you afraid of if we do it differently, or if we do screw it up, or we, like what is driving that fear for people, do you think?
I think it's because oftentimes we over-index on the what, to your point, right? Like we over-index on whatever metric we're trying to hit, whatever goal, target, whatever, we over-index on that versus focusing on how we get there, the behaviors to get there. To your point, why are we driving to that? Why are we trying to get there? And, there's different ways to get from point A to point B. And I think the fear is that if they let up the reins, that they're not going to get to point B. They're not going to get to that goal. They're not going to get to that target, whatever. And then it's a reflection on their leadership. But the bummer is that because when we get in those environments, we focus so heavily on the what, they don't know how to get to the what. Right. And so they're just going to fail regardless.
Failure.
Right? They're just going to fail. And so I think it's that dance between knowing which leaders really need you to get down in the mud with them and show them how to do the things versus which leaders you can give some rein to. And again, like we talked about before, here are the parameters. Here's what I don't want you to cross. Here's where it's gone off the rails. But if it's not within those parameters, go with God, and report back. And then I also think it's important to inspect what you expect. And I learned that hard as a regional leader,
Yes. I was going to say that. I think in my experience, I very rarely, if maybe ever, got shown what success looks like other than exceeding the goal. And that was really hard. You're not always going to exceed the goal. I mean, I ran some very profitable practices and everybody's going to have bad days. Everybody's going to have bad months. And one of the things that drove me crazy as a hospital leader was when I felt like the only acceptable success was to hit the goal or hit the metric every single time. And there was no room for the variability that comes with veterinary medicine. And I know that's why a lot of people get really frustrated and it's lumped together the idea of corporate environment, right? And I heard this a lot when I have talked on the podcast about having had a great experience working in corporate medicine. And I got it a lot from my friends who were just like, oh, well, every corporate just, manages you to a spreadsheet and you have all these goals and you have to meet them. And that part, I had that experience with some leaders and not all of them. And I think that's one of the things I love about you is that I know that your philosophy as a leader of people is really different. And it's not that, because if you do that, there will always be disappointments because there's so much variability. It's not like I can tell you every single day what's going to come in the door. Even if I have a rock star team, they are not capable of predicting and making it all happen. There is variability in what we do every single day. And so I think that the leaders who only know how to define success by hitting or exceeding the goal every time fail and fail hard because their teams then fail and fail hard.
Totally agree with you. I mean, I think, to me, it's like a physical exam and blood work. You need both of them at the end of the day, right? Yeah. There's not an or, it's an and. And to me, that's like the how and the what. You need both of them together to be successful. And it's so much easier to just focus on the what. It really is, because it's clear, it's a spreadsheet, it's a metric, whatever. But the how is peopling at the end of the day, right? Because it's behaviors. And so you need them together. And I think the best leaders are able to balance the two, right? Maybe you didn't hit the target. However, the how is very nicely documented. You had really clear behaviors to get you to the what. And to your point, the variability of veterinary medicine, right? Like, here's what happened and here's my plan to get to the what by when. You know, it's to me, it's about being able to articulate those things. And if you over-index on one versus the other, because it's not good to just be like fluffy, unicorn fairy dust of like, they just tried really, really hard,
Right. You still have to run a business.
You still have to run a business. You still have to have results.
You have to open the doors.
And I think we sometimes over-index on one versus the other. Right. It's not an or, it's an and.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. The exam and blood work analogy makes a lot of sense. Or like when we do a dental, if we just scale and polish the teeth, we're only seeing a fraction of what could be there. And so that tracks, it makes sense for us. And yet it's also one of the hardest things for us to get clients to understand. And so we have to be really solid in our feelings and our understanding of that to be able to do that education. And I think it's the same in the leadership here.
100%.
Like when you become a leader, that's when your true successes happen, when you can do that balancing act and you can lean when you need to into one and then lean back into the other. And I think this is all the stuff that I would say the majority of the people that I know in leadership in veterinary medicine, whether it's in a single hospital or someone like yourself who is, at a leadership level where you're overseeing hundreds of hospitals, you don't get taught it. Most of us don't have that education. We're put into a leadership position because we're good at our last job. And so learning about failure, learning about fear, learning about vulnerability, learning about how to talk to our teams about what success looks like, what failure could look like, what is acceptable levels of failure. Like, hey, okay, as a leader, if I tell the team, okay, how do they know what a full day looks like? I have to show them. I have to teach them that expectation. And so many times when I see problems and challenges that we're having in the hospital, it comes as a result of us not actually explaining what success looks like to our team. And I think that's why we have a lot of failure, because we, as the leaders, have an expectation or a target or something in mind. But if we don't teach the team what we want that to look like, they might get there. Sometimes lightning strikes, right? Like sometimes it happens just naturally. The majority of the teams, though, the getting there, if they get there, and that's a big if, is going to be really painful because you're setting them up for a failure along the way by not showing them what success looks like.
Or what's expected of them. We as human beings have an inherent need to know what is expected. And am I doing a good job? And when I'm not doing a good job, what did I do? And, help me fix it kind of thing. Right. And so to your point, it's like, if we don't paint done for our teams, they don't know when to stop. You know what I mean? Or if they're not doing it right. And so that is not a fun environment to exist in. We waste a lot of energy in those environments. We make mistakes. Those are the things that tend to happen. And I'm a big fan of energy management. My kids are probably tired of hearing me talk about it, to be honest. We talk a lot about energy management and, wasting energy on things that don't add value,
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. Okay. So from a headspace perspective, we've been talking a lot about how do we feel and what are things that we should think about as a leader. And I have one last question really in that realm. And then I want to talk about how do we actually deal with failure and how do we not only deal with it, but set the team up for success, right? But from a headspace perspective, as a leader, how do you approach creating the environment where the team feels safe to take the risks that might lead to failure, but may also lead to significant rewards in the long run?
Yeah. I mean, I think I'm a big fan of ways of working.
Explain just on a high level the idea of ways of working, because I think this is really important. Yeah. I think that people outside of Banfield could benefit tremendously from this as well.
A high level, ways of working is just a mutual agreement, right? It's about what am I going to do as your leader and what are you going to do as part of the team? And it's about defining, how do you like to be recognized? How do you like to receive feedback? Me as a leader to, my team, where do I want you to raise your hand? What's that acceptable threshold of risk? And, what do I expect when you do step in it? Because we all will. And what does that personal accountability actually look like? And then that ways of working, or the wow, takes care and feeding. It's not like we talk about it once and we put it on the shelf. We take it off the shelf and we talk about it, on a cadence, whether that's once a year, whether that's twice a year, whatever, right? But to me, it's about that mutual agreement that's so important to create the environment where it is safe to fail. And then I think the other thing that I love doing with my team, and I got it now that I'm saying it out loud, I need to get back to doing this because it's fallen off, but is the rose and thorn exercise. So what's one thing that was really great And what's one thing that wasn't so great,
Yeah.
And we just talk about it,
Yeah.
And open, and that just makes it, A, it models the right behavior, but B, it makes it safe and approachable to talk about good things and bad things.
Not so great things. Yeah. I love that. It's funny because before we started working with you all and some of your leaders, I had been talking, and we had talked extensively in the community, the Uncharted community, about team agreements, because that's how they were introduced to me when I was a baby manager. We worked with a consultant, and one of the first things that they had us do was like sit down as a team and talk about how do we, just at a really high level, how do we show up for each other? And what are those unspoken rules? Like, because I think that's where a lot of failure comes from in the practice dynamic for me as an employee. I can recall multiple times where I was asked to be accountable to something that I didn't know was even a rule. Or like to your point, we sat down for a review and I'm getting marked down for something that I didn't even occur to me that would be looked at through that lens, or would be like, okay, now we're having a conversation about something that happened 6 months ago. Like, how can I fix that? That was 6 months ago. And how is it have that much relevance and importance in this current state? And so I think for a lot of us, like sitting down and, to your point, talking about how do we want to show up for each other? How are we going to hold each other accountable? But also, what are those unspoken rules? And to your point, where are the places where it's okay to screw up? And even better for me, where are the places where you are totally okay to take ownership and autonomy? I don't care what you do, as long as this is what the end result is, and get there and I'm happy. Like, I don't, to maybe tell me about it and talk me through your thought process, because that's a part of the learning and growing process. But I remember when I first got going as a manager and I went to one of my first VHMA conferences, I remember sitting at a table and talking to other managers, and we were talking about client problems. And I said, well, my team is allowed to do whatever they want as long as it's going to cost less than $100. And I remember everybody at that table kind of looking at me, and I was like, what did I just say? And they were just like, well, that's so much money. And I was like, is it though? In the grand scheme of things, if the team is empowered to solve a problem and a client walks away happy, do I care if they give away a bag of CET chews or a bag of greenies? Like, yes, sometimes it might cost $100, but the majority of the time when they're problem solving and they have that autonomy, it's under $20, that whatever solution that they're coming up with, and they come up with some amazing solutions. And that growth, that development as employees, that autonomy, that doesn't happen if we don't, as leaders, figure out what is that acceptable level of failure. And for me, the acceptable level of client failure is, look, if you can solve that problem under $100 and avoid the client failure, do it. Because I don't want that client on my desk. I don't want to have to make that phone call over something that, if you gave away a free bag of chews, or you gave them a free bath if we have grooming services, or whatever it is, and you solve their problem, that is, stellar success in my book. Because not only do I not have to then deal with that client, but you also have the opportunity to learn and grow and tell me about what decision you made and why did you make that decision? What did you think would make that be a solution? Because that may be something that then can impact beyond that client and that moment. It can impact the team as a whole. And I think as leaders, we get so focused on what do I do when things don't go right? And we don't focus enough on how can I help them make things go right?
Yeah. Yes. I mean, I think the thing that used to resonate a lot with me is kind of the internal question of, if I step in and do this for them, am I stealing their growth? Because there's been times as a leader where I have done that, and it was because I was afraid to let them fail, because they might fail in some of those spaces, right? And so I think it's so important to just be really clear on, again, what are those boundaries? It was $100 for you, right? But what are those boundaries?
Yeah.
And as long as it's below the boundary, go with God, and we're going to talk about it, And I want to be an exporter of talent. That is what I want to be as a leader. I don't want to be a leader that takes talent in and then squanders it, if you will. And I'm always thinking in my brain about, okay, am I setting my people up to get growth and development? Am I stepping in too much? Am I stepping in not enough? But I think that's an important exercise to do because our people are our legacy at the end of the day. If we don't have our teams or our people, we don't have a business, And so it's so important to just focus on the people.
I love that. Okay, let's take a quick break, and then I want to talk about some of the action step questions that I've got, because I think that's one of the hardest things is trying to figure out, okay, well, if I want to let them fail, how the heck do I actually do that and not have it fall apart? So let's take a quick break and then we'll be right back. So we talked a lot about, how do you feel? How do I feel? Like, how do we get there from a headspace perspective? But how do we, from an action step perspective, if we can get into the headspace and be accepting of the idea that we should want our people to fail. We should want them to be able to have some level of acceptable threshold where we say, screw it up. And then let's figure out how we do it differently next time, because that's where the real growth happens. If we're on board with that train of thought, how do we communicate the value of that to the team and still maintain accountability so that it doesn't become the Wild West where everything is just a hot mess, dumpster fire, and nobody has responsibility for anything?
Yeah. I mean, I think we've talked a lot about the things, and I think it's always important to have success very clearly defined, paint done for them, right?
Okay.
What does it look like to be successful? If it's a project, if it's, in the role, whatever, right? Like just what does good look like? I think that's one actionable thing. And have it be a conversation. You want feedback from them. You have a vision, but they may also have a vision. So it probably needs to meet in the middle somewhere.
In the middle. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
And then I think the other piece that's really important is understanding what is that acceptable level of threshold. And then what do you expect as their leader if and when failure happens? What does that look like? Is that an email? Is that a pick up the phone? Is that a standing agenda item on your one-on-ones, which would be like one of my favorite things to think about doing. But those, I think, are some easy things. And then I think there's something about building it into just your ways of working with your team. If you have a team meeting, normalizing when we make mistakes, and letting everybody have a moment, whether it be the front desk or the most tenured technician or the doctor, or if you're in an office environment, the specialist versus the director, all have a moment, if they want, to share what is one win that you had this week and what's the poopsie, Mm-hmm. I think those are all really easy, actionable things.
I love that. I think the best way that I was taught to think about it, and I had a mentor early on in my career who said, what do we do when a patient dies? I said, well, we do, because I was in tech school at the time. And I said, well, we do morbidity rounds. We talk about it. Like, if a patient dies in the hospital, what do we do? And what happens when we do, postmortems? Well, sometimes we talk it through and everybody did everything right. There's nothing that we could have done, and we still have that outcome. Okay. Then we talk about, what are we going to learn from this and how are we going to move forward? Sometimes we talk about it and we realize that there was human error, because we are humans at the end of the day. And sometimes that human error directly impacts the end result, and sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it doesn't matter that we made a mistake. We were, there was still other things that caused that end result. And so when we do a morbidity round, the end result is still the same. We're regardless of whether mistakes were made or not, we're still talking about, what do we learn from it? And how do we do it again next time, so that we're not going into it with fear, with trepidation, with concern over the thing, because we're looking at it from the perspective of, the thing happened. I can't change that it happened. I can only choose how I'm going to learn from it and how I'm going to move forward. And they said that is how we should look at all of the things that happen in our job and in our careers, and especially when we make mistakes. And it was like that light bulb moment where, talking about it, for like when you talked about the exam and the blood work, it just unlocked in my head that, hey, okay, that makes perfect sense to me. Like, there are going to be times where we do everything right and it still we don't hit the goal or things still fall apart. And there are going to be times where we screw it up and we make mistakes. And what we have to figure out is, were those mistakes that would have gotten us to that same end result, or were those catastrophic mistakes? Did that pet die because we gave it the wrong medication, or because the endotracheal tube was placed incorrectly, or whatever the reason is? Was that mistake catastrophic? And then what happens? I have watched amazing doctors step up and hold a client's hand and say, this was the mistake that was made. We own that. There's nothing that we wish more than the fact that we could undo that, but we can't. And we still have to figure out how to move forward, right? And that is that modeled, seeing that behavior, seeing that ownership over our mistakes as leaders, I think is the number one way that we can teach the team that it is okay to screw it up, is when we lean in and say, hey, I am a human and this is how I screwed it up as well.
I totally agree with you. I mean, I think, one of the things that I love most about where I work is just this culture of safety that we've built and this patient safety journey that we have been on, where it is anybody can raise their hand and say, I'm uncomfortable. I don't feel safe. I'm worried about this patient, right? And we talk about when bad things happen. We have a reporting system where you can go in and report when something happens or something almost happened, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
I think where we still have growth just in general, right? Not just Banfield, just as organizationally, is exactly what you're talking about. Like, we've built these foundations about what do we do when bad things happen to our patients. We probably still have some growth there, because I have seen blaming, right? Like all of the things that happen, but we should be applying those same behaviors to when we make mistakes, people to people, because those things happen, right?
Yes.
Or a communication thing, or, I forgot to do X, Y, and Z, whatever, right?
Yes.
It's the same muscle. It just looks different. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. And it is true, right? And I think that's the biggest area of opportunity for most of us is the other stuff.
Oh, the soft skills. Yes.
Yeah, the soft skills. And when you think about it, that's where the majority of the mistakes happen. I mean, sometimes you have, a team where for whatever reason, lots of job mistakes are happening. But when we put the time in, when we have a high performing team, most of the time the mistakes are happening on all the soft stuff.
Yep.
Whether it's client facing or internally or both, like that's where it falls apart. Okay. Last question for you. This has been so great. I could talk to you about this all day, but what advice would you give to a leader if you were talking to someone just the way that you and I were talking about, and the leader is hesitant to let their people fail? Because we're a field that's full of people who are overachievers, gold stars, want it all to be right. What would you say if you had to look at that leader and say, maybe you should rethink that, because you believe truly as a leader that failure is good? What advice would you give them?
I mean, I would first ask them why. Why are you scared, to allow failure? I think the other thing that I would certainly talk to this leader about is just how unrealistic it is to think that you're going to have a team that never makes mistakes, and the consequences of setting that environment forth. And if they're a data-driven human, there's lots of data out there that points to just the importance of creating these cultures where it feels safe and where you have a sense of belonging, and what that does from a performance perspective, because a people strategy is a business strategy. And so, I think we sometimes forget that because we're so focused on the what. And getting to the what, we forget that the people are how we get to the what. And we got to focus on the people first. And, I would give them the same advice that we just talked through in the action steps, right? It's important to define what those thresholds are. It's important to define what good looks like. And then it's really important to follow up and follow through once you have those things defined. Hey, I noticed that you went, above $100 last week. Tell me why you did that. We had aligned to less than $100, right? So I think those are the things, and that makes it feel less ambiguous and scary and gray when you have those things clearly defined. And then it almost doesn't feel like failure. It just feels like learning at the end of the day.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. I love that. I love that so much, because as a leader, my job gets infinitely easier when I set them up that way, because
100%.
now instead of during the one-on-one having to ask you, hey, I noticed that this thing happened. If you have trained your team and taught them, let me tell you from personal experience, there were times where I would get a note in my thing saying, hey, FYI, I spent $150 I wrote $150 off Mrs. Jones' bill. Here's why. Just wanted you to know what I was thinking. They're doing my job for me. All I have to do is go, cool, okay, now I'm aware of that, so that if somebody else asks me, I can also give that explanation and explain it, right? But it has become a learning opportunity, and no one questions that. But I think as leaders, we're so afraid of like, oh God, am I going to have to explain somebody else's mistake?
Go down the what if rabbit hole. You know what I mean? It's like, if I do this, oh my gosh, here's what could happen, right?
Yes.
And it's like,
yes.
I guess I would challenge the leader to think, what happens if I don't do it, right? Then you are, to your point, you're in doing all the things all the time. Your team cannot function without you. And that is not a fun place to be in.
Miserable place to be.
Right? Yeah, no, thank you.
Oh my God. Megan, thank you so much for having this conversation with me. This was fun.
Of course.
I love it. And I love that it's a good challenge for leaders, because fear is scary. Failure is scary.
It's so scary.
And, we're afraid of failing our clients, our patients, all of that. And if you live in that state of fear all the time, that's the quickest path to burnout. And I think that's one of the things I can appreciate is you and I both had that as part of our journey. And when you get there, it's a miserable place to be. And also being in that place as a leader where you are doing all of the things because you're so afraid of everybody else making mistakes or failing that you just go the path of, well, I'll just do it myself because then I know it'll be done right.
Yeah.
That is also a miserable place to live. And so, I think the best thing that we can do as leaders is talk about it more and make it okay to talk about it and to do it and screw it up. Because to your original point, we're all human and we're all going to make mistakes.
True statement.
Oh, thank you so much.
You're
Have
welcome.
a great week, everybody. We will see you again next time. And that's a wrap on another episode of the Uncharted Podcast. Thanks for joining us and spending your week with us. If you enjoyed this week's episode, head over to wherever you get your podcasts and leave us a review. It's the best way to let us know that you love listening. We'll see you next time.